the first director of climate action engagement at the University of Michigan. That's housed under the School of Environment and Sustainability. And there she's leading an initiative that's trying to link the university's research um, and collaborations and engagement with external partners to accelerate climate action across the state of Michigan and beyond. Before this role, she served as director of the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or EAGLE, in Michigan. Still the coolest state DNR name, essentially. And she worked in Governor Gretchen Whitmer's cabinet, chaired the Council on Climate Solutions, and led development of the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. So, Liesl, it's awesome to have you here, and thanks for joining us. And then Ode Salim is an adjunct clinical assistant professor of law and director of the Environmental Law and Sustainability Clinic at Michigan Law. He's also an attorney at the National Wildlife Federation and its Great Lakes Regional Center. Ode has spoken to us a whole bunch of times, and he makes really complicated legal things understandable. And he has some thoughts on stuff journalists should be paying attention to. So we're excited to have him as well. And I'm not sure which of you to queue up first. I don't know if you guys care, but I'm going to
I
make
don't
you
care.
both.
Liesel has slides. She's talking
Okay.
about the interesting topic, not the boring topic. So I feel like it'd be better if she led, if she's okay with that.
That works. That works for me. All right. So you actually are both now co-hosts. So Lisa, you should be able to share your screen.
Alrighty, let me queue them up. Do. Hit a bunch of buttons. I appreciate O'Day saying I'm the interesting one. I think he's the interesting one, but whatever. All right,
And
let's see.
for our reporters, if you can hide your faces during the presentations if you want, but we do ask you to show your faces when we do Q&A because we want this to be as human as possible. So,
I do like human. Okay, let's see if I can make this work. Hmm.
is it not showing up?
Sorry, still clicking. Still
Yeah,
clicking.
here it goes.
How
It's
do we do?
something's happening.
Can we
We're
see
on it.
slide?
Bingo.
Oh, wow, it's a miracle. So I have to apologize too. We had a natural gas leak in our house last night. And so I was up till about 3, visiting with our good friends from Consumers. I do still have natural gas in my house. Hopefully all this clicking and speaking goes okay. So anyway, just gonna give you a disclaimer there. Thank you so much for the introduction, Adam. I'm really excited to be able to join all of you. I think what you do is really the interesting work, and I'm fortunate to know a few of you from past work as well. So looking forward to the conversation today. So I'm going to talk a bit about climate action as well as just highlight some big trends that we see. So first, a couple slides on who I am, which you already got an overview from the outset. I've also spent some time in the private sector. So I'm co-founder of Five Lakes Energy, which is a pretty awesome consulting firm based here in Michigan, but does work across the country on clean energy and the energy transition, as well as I served as president of the Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council, which is 160 companies in Michigan that are doing work in this important space. So I've spent a little time over there on the private sector side as well. And then you heard a bit on the public sector side. So served at the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. Thank you for the shout out to the acronym. So the governor really, when we reorganized DEQ, the governor really wanted Great Lakes in the title. And she was really stuck on Department of Great Lakes, Environment and Energy. And I told her, I'm like, Governor, nobody wants a permit denied by glee. Like, that's just not going to work. So anyway, we ended up at Eagle for better or for worse. I also spent some time working in the Granholm administration in a variety of capacities, which is really what got me deeply interested in the energy transition work. I guess it probably comes as no surprise to some folks that Jennifer Granholm's fairly compelling, both about the topic itself as well as about what that path forward can look like for the state as well as for the nation as we go through that transition. So I'm going to talk about some of the statistics that are standing out right now in that space. So we did mention up front the My Healthy Climate Plan. I think it's an important framework for Michigan. And of course, there are structures like this that are existing in other states, then these states are all, working these plans in order to smooth this transition that, we're all going through right now from an energy perspective. But the My Healthy Climate Plan, I think, is important because it gives us the high level pillars around where we're seeing emissions and then how to take steps within those pillars to move forward. So how to take that strategy and implement it tactically so that we're really seeing that progress play out. And that's certainly what's moving forward here in the state of Michigan. And then I moved over to academia, which is where I get to work closely with O'Day here at the university. So I'm going to talk a bit about trends at a high level. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that affordability is certainly one of the key issues that we're dealing with across the country, as well as here in Michigan, as we're going through the energy transition. And then certainly reliability, something that's gotten a lot of reports in the state of Michigan as we're going through rebuilding our distribution grid. Our distribution grid was really underdeveloped for quite some time. And so if you look, for example, at the recent LBNL report on electricity prices, one of the things that it really points to is that rebuilding of the distribution grid. And then, of course, you can't talk about the energy transition without talking about increasing demand and how we're seeing the influx of data centers and AI having a potential impact on increasing demand, as well as the fact that as we're going through decarbonization, we know how to decarbonize our electricity sector. And so that's why we're seeing a push to electrify everything from electric vehicles to homes to get them off natural gas for heating and cooling. But making other sorts of progress there, coupling that with data center demand, we really are seeing a very different trend here. In the past, over the last couple of decades, 3 decades or so, what we've seen is demand for electricity has paralleled GDP growth. And so in the 2 to 3% space, we've never seen it as big as it could potentially be right now. And of course, another one of those big questions is how real is that demand? How much of that is speculative in the data center space? So a few important statistics about where the energy transition is in Michigan. We're at 8,300 megawatts of renewable deployed with a 40% increase in the last 2 years. We've also seen 17% increase in distributed gen, so that's in your rooftop solar and your smaller level deployments. And we're at 126,000 jobs in the clean energy space in Michigan, which is also a growing sector. Not totally sure what we'll see from federal statistics in order to help us track some of these things, but some of those are a combination of federal and state statistics, so we've got some confidence there. But there are certainly other parts to this story about the energy transition, particularly when we look at what pieces intersect from the state level with the federal level, like the Palisades nuclear plant restarting, which of course has been a big push over the last few years. The Campbell coal plant being forced to stay open at the cost of over $600,000 a day, which totals around 80 million since May. So you can see why, all of this kind of marries together with challenges around affordability. We've also seen some pretty impressive transmission steps in Michigan in the last few months where we've seen approval for transmission build-out, which is really going to improve those seams that we're struggling with moving large amounts of energy across the U.S. And finally, some of you, I should have gone and pulled some of your own bylines on this. What is going on with data centers? Where is this going to go? So I'm going to set aside ethical AI use and what is AI and what does the future of that look like. And I'm just going to mention like both the water side and then the electricity side. So, on the water side, there's a lot of work happening at the university as well as other parts. I was talking to MSU and talking to Eagle and others about what does that water use really look like. I think many of you have done a lot of research into this. We see where you can use less water but more electricity in order to cool the systems. And so what's that going to look like? I think folks are aware that in Michigan, there's a push. If you're going to get the MEDC dollars and tax incentives, you've got to be connected to a municipal system because we are able to watch water quality and quantity through those municipal systems. I can tell you some stories from my seat at Eagle of where that really worked well. And we were able to protect citizens and protect our water systems because the physical system, the environmental system, the ecosystem, because companies were on municipal water systems. So there is some benefit there. However, the question is, what does dewatering look like for construction? What is, so there's still a lot of puzzles there, and that are going to play out over the next few months that really need visibility. The biggest piece here is, in my opinion, is community engagement, public transparency, and transparency about what are these projects going to be doing in terms of water use. And then there's electricity use, which is a whole nother fascinating topic. We're seeing a lot of growth and interest in both of the IOUs, investor-owned utilities in Michigan. However, they've taken very different perspectives. So DTE they're long on energy. They're selling into the grid. Consumers on the other side of the state is short on energy. So they're tighter when it comes to generation. And what we've seen is two different tactics. So DTE filed a case with the Public Service Commission a couple of weeks ago that looks specifically at how are they going to handle a new data center in Saline Township. I think folks are pretty aware. But their approach is, how do they service that particular data center? And Consumers has taken a different approach where they filed with the Public Service Commission to set a tariff for data centers. And so that was filed in the spring and decided by the Public Service Commission just a couple of weeks ago. And it sets parameters for, as Consumers is looking at future data centers, what is the structure that the tariff will have, and how does it protect residential ratepayers, as well as make sure that they're, servicing that customer and that load in a way that's going to, ease on the grid. So two different tactics. In the meantime, in the background, both Consumers and DTE will be filing integrated resource plans in 2026. Yes, in 2026. So that's interesting too, because those integrated resource plans fit together energy use overall and give, again, transparency and visibility into what does that planning system look like and where is all that going. So that was a lot just in a few minutes, but I think some things that I think are pretty fascinating in this space that I wanted to share, and happy to talk. Also, I know that, Oday's got some important pieces on this side of the world as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Liesl. So, folks, we'll hold our questions till both speakers have gone, and then we can ask both of them at the same time. So, Oday, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam and Dave, for having me again. So what I'm going to present on briefly came out of a conversation that I had with Dave over coffee at a coffee shop in Ann Arbor. Many of us who practice environmental law and who teach environmental law have to also practice and teach administrative law. So we often get in the news in order to discuss environmental statutes and regulations. And we talk about substantive issues like greenhouse gas emission reporting, or pollution control, or how federal or state land is managed. But there is an infrastructure that is underneath and that supports those sort of substantive opinions and topics, which is the administrative law infrastructure, and that's the law that governs how governments operate. What can a legislature tell a federal or an executive branch agency to do? When an executive branch agency makes one decision or another, is it legitimate? Is there enough authority for it? And when an executive branch agency makes a decision, is that any different than the executive himself or herself making the decision, the president or the governor? So that administrative law is there now in 90% of what we call environmental, climate change, and natural resources law. It didn't used to be the case. Up until the 1970s, a lot of environmental law was really common law. It was torts, private actions, one private party suing another private party for some kind of damage to their property. There were some statutes on the books, but there wasn't really a lot of enforcement in courts. There weren't really a lot of agencies making decisions, making rules, and issuing permits. Really, the last 50, 55 years, has been not only the creation of the really formal administrative state, but at the same time, the formation of environmental and natural resources laws as administrative laws, as things that government agencies by and large do, and how the government agencies regulate private parties and private behavior. And what I was pointing out to Dave was that, and it could be that it's appropriate to do it this way. But one thing that I noticed, I was reading a number of articles about major decisions coming out of the Supreme Court, and one thing that the federal Supreme Court has done is it's really, remade administrative law in the last 5, 6 years. It has issued some monumental opinions that have caused us to rethink how administrative law actually applies. And one thing that I noticed is that oftentimes when I'm reading reporting or long form journalism or blog posts or tweets, all different kinds of journalistic expression. I had noticed that there was an excellent coverage of the substantive environmental or natural resources or climate or wildlife management topics. And so there was a lot of great focus and helpful focus on the substantive outcome of one decision or another, less focus, sometimes no focus, on how the court arrived at that decision using administrative law. Now, I think I probably know why. I don't remember which of our guests is a novelist now. Easier to write a novel about climate, harder to write a novel about the major questions doctrine. I get it. But I do think it's important. I work at a law school where there is an outsized number of faculty members who do administrative law. And so there's a lot of administrative law discussion happening among the faculty and with our guests and with our students. So it could be that this is, creeping into my thinking, but administrative law is obviously important because it's the law that is the infrastructure for a lot of the substantive law that we know and discuss. It's also important because it wrestles with the earliest questions that were wrestled with at the founding, questions about the separation of powers, questions about the scope of authority of each individual constitutional branch, questions about the Constitution itself and what it means and how it's supposed to govern a community over not only decades but centuries. So it's rooted in those things too, which is why I think it's so incredibly important. I just thought I'd provide a couple of examples so that we can kind of see and feel and touch what I'm talking about. One of them is a pure administrative law example that I thought reported on the outcome but missed the whole administrative law point of the opinion. Another one is more of an environmental example. The administrative law example is a case from 2020, from the 2024 term called called FCC versus Consumers Research. And it was a case about, I don't know how many people remember this case, but it was a case about whether a certain charge could be levied in order to collect money and make sure that rural communities had access to certain broadband, and other, communications platforms. And one of the questions was whether this charge, could be imposed by the FCC, whether it was being imposed fairly, justifiably or not. And the reporting on this opinion was really, really focused on the FCC, on the charge, on rural communities and their need to access these kinds of communications platforms. And all of that is totally understandable because that's ultimately what the result was. But I think what a lot of people missed was the following. For years now, there has been a power struggle at the Supreme Court and among the federal and within the federal courts about something called the non-delegation doctrine, which has huge significance for environmental, natural resources, and climate law. Most of the administrative law doctrines that get discussed in the news are doctrines that will shape what an agency can do. Once it potentially has the authority to act, how much can it act? What can it do? What can it not do? So it's really focused on the agency. This is one of the few areas of administrative law that's not focused so much on agencies, but on Congress, on legislatures. The question under the non-delegation doctrine is how much can a legislature delegate to an executive branch agency? Are there some things that you just cannot delegate? Just one example that's in the news now because it's about the tariff cases is, can Congress delegate the taxation authority to agencies, or is Congress only able to exercise that taxation authority? Can Congress in the future delegate war-making powers to an executive branch agency? So this was really a question about whether Congress could delegate what the court was deciding, was a kind of taxation power, or was it, that was really the question is, was it a taxation power or not? But the question was, could the Congress delegate that kind of ability for the agency to raise money from, different regulated entities regulated by the FCC in order to fund, rural broadband? And the reason why it's got such import for environmental, natural resources, and climate law is because there's often this question about whether Congress is defining accurately enough what it's delegating to an agency and what it isn't. And Justice Gorsuch, as soon as he became Supreme Court Justice, made it very clear that he wanted to expand the non-delegation doctrine. In other words, to make it harder for Congress to delegate to delegate different responsibilities to agencies. That the current test for the non-delegation doctrine, which is called the intelligible principle standard, was really not a test at all. It's almost never that Congress fails the test. Almost always there's some intelligible principle that Congress provides for an agency to do something. And Gorsuch thought that that was just too low of a bar, that we needed to raise the bar. And that would mean agencies doing even less than what the Supreme Court currently allows them to do. And that would have huge impacts in environmental, climate, natural resources law. And for a long time, Chief Justice Roberts, as Gorsuch was issuing dissenting opinions and desiring the expansion of this doctrine and the replacement of the intelligible principle standard, Chief Justice Roberts was actually co-signing those opinions and expressing interest in what Gorsuch wanted to do with the doctrine. And in FCC versus consumers, that all comes to a halt. Not only does Chief Justice Roberts not join the Gorsuch opinion, but Chief Justice Roberts assigns the opinion to Justice Elena Kagan, one of the Obama nominees, and kind of puts an end to this for the most part, non-delegation doctrine, at least probably for a generation, and says, I'm not curious anymore. We're just going to stop right now, and I'm not gonna any further, entertain this. Which, of course, in a 6-3 conservative court, it still makes it quite challenging for this to come up again if Chief Justice Roberts isn't behind it. Now, as it happens, the court decided that this charge was more of a fee than a tax, that it was fine. Congress was able to delegate the authority, and it didn't, violate the doctrine. But the real story here, I think, was that for years there was this concern among the nonprofit community and among even to some extent the regulated community that the non-delegation doctrine would be expanded, that the court would add yet another obstacle to what agencies could do to protect the environment and natural resources. And it didn't. Now, it didn't exactly make it easier, but it also didn't make it much, much more challenging. And I understand that that's a challenging story to tell and to interest people in, but it's so vital. And found myself reading all of these pieces on the opinion, saying, "Wow, where's this underlying, important tale that needs to be told about how this administrative limitation doctrine is not going to be expanded as many feared." Now, the quick environmental example that I'll provide is the recent case about the National Environmental Policy Act. This was an opinion, again, a Supreme Court opinion authored by Justice Kavanaugh, where the Supreme Court decides that the complying with the National Environmental Policy Act will be easier than what many environmental advocates would have wanted, right? So NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, essentially requires government agencies to stop and think before they take a certain action and to think about the environmental consequences of their action. And the concern here was, where does that end? consequences, right? If you think about the butterfly, effect and chaos theory, right? Any one thing can impact a number of other things. So where do you stop that line of consequences? This was a case about a railroad line that was going to be constructed, and the government agency was going to issue permits for it, but it was going to make it possible for there to be some kind of energy export. And so the question was, do you look at the environmental impact just of the railroad itself, the railroad line itself, or do you also look at the environmental impacts of the energy exports that the rail line would facilitate? So if the rail line's not there, you don't have those exports in the same number. If the rail line is there, you have many more of those exports. And many environmental advocates want the answer to be, yeah, you got to go all the way. You got to think about all of the end consequences of this seemingly narrow decision that you're making. And understandably, many in the regulated community thought no. Many in industry and business thought no. You really need to just look at the project in front of you. And quote unquote, industry won. The Supreme Court sided with the government and said, yeah, you're allowed to just look at the project in front of you, and you don't have to go all the way to those indirect consequences. Now, this was reported correctly, accurately, as a decision that would hurt, environmentalism, environmental protection, et cetera. And that probably is true. But one thing that I thought was missed in the reporting and in the analysis of the opinion was that Justice Kavanaugh actually applied this deference doctrine from the Loper-Bright opinion that I'm sure everybody is familiar with, which says, courts are no longer going to just defer to administrative agencies when there's some statutory ambiguity. We, the courts, are going to make the decision about what a statute means. And Justice Kavanaugh actually, and most environmental advocates, I think wrongly, but putting that aside, most environmental advocates think that providing less deference is bad for environmental decision making, providing more deference is good. Putting the merits of that debate aside, many people just assumed that Justice Kavanaugh, who supported the Loper-Bright decision that basically limited deference or eliminated deference to agencies, that he would actually apply deference here. But that's because what Loper-Bright does is it does not eliminate deference to agencies at all. What Loper-Bright does is it eliminates presumptive deference to agencies. When the statute itself isn't clear that Congress wants the courts to defer to agencies, then courts will not defer to agencies. But when it's clear that Congress does want deference to an agency, that it wants an agency to make a very specific kind of decision, well, then courts should defer to that agency. So that opinion wasn't just an opinion about the limitation on NEPA. That opinion was also an opinion about how important it is for environmental advocates to be advocating for statutes that clearly define deference, because deference is very much alive and well when the statute actually provides for it. It's just when the statute doesn't directly provide for it that it's dead. And I thought that was really missing from a lot of the opinions. And of course, why does Justice Kavanaugh, for those who are cynical and want to just assume that the court's opinion is going to be pro-industry anyway, why does Justice Kavanaugh's opinion, why should it be regarded as pro-industry? Because the truth is that many agencies, if given the option, because they have limited resources, are not going to want to do a costly, if incredibly expensive, and totally exhaustive analysis of every possible analysis. They may want a more reasonable ending point, and this was a way for agencies to more reasonably limit where they could end their analysis. So I'll end now and just say that again, there may be reasons not to do it that are beyond my ken, but as somebody who is very interested and motivated and who works within administrative law all the time, I wish there were more administrative law in what we read about substantive environmental, natural resources, and climate decisions.
Awesome. Thanks, Ode. So folks, now is time for you to ask any question that's on your mind to these wonderful folks who've volunteered their time to field them. The way you're going to do that is in the chat. Let me know that you have a question and I will call on you. And that is a much saner way to approach this than everyone raising the little yellow hands and then I don't know who to call on first. So whoever's ready to go, let me know. And we'll start Q&A. And sometimes all it takes is the first, and Rachel can go.
I figured I'd break the ice.
Yeah.
I guess my question is about just the transmission lines build up in Michigan and just kind of I know there's been some surrounding concerns around it with regards to like eminent domain. If I guess either of you could just give me sort of the landscape and kind of give me some sort of overall view of this transmission buildup there.
I can go, O'Day. I know you know a lot in this space too. So transmission build goes through our inner MISO, which is our mid-continent service operator. So they do the coordination of the transmission work. And so we just had it was called Tranche 2, I believe, if I remember correctly, approved, which is a combination of work that happens, to your point, around eminent domain, very much at the local level, as well as all the way up to like states communicating with each other. And there was, a bit of controversy as usual with this one too, between states. The biggest issue, well, there are multiple issues with transmission build. One of the challenges is how do you correctly allocate costs for that build? And how does that flow down to the customers that are able to take advantage of it, knowing that, transmission build is an important part of getting rid of the seams across the country in order to move electricity from where we're in some cases able to generate more cheaply to places that we need it because there's higher load and higher demand. So yeah, this one in particular was the first one that had moved forward, and I want to say it was like 15 years. So there are a lot of different places that transmission build can get hung up from the federal level all the way down to local challenges. And, as I said, when it comes to data centers, I think this is true with transmission build too, which is we've got to have very open and transparent processes where there are a lot of opportunities for communities to understand what the potentials are, and then also for their voices to be heard about how they see themselves as being part of this project. And this particular round of transmission build, none of them are perfect by any means. And now we just get into the building process, which is always a bit complicated as well. But it's an important part of making sure that we've got a fully operational energy system that's going to allow us to take advantage of decarbonized power where possible.
I'll just add briefly, I mean, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has been and is continuing to think through transmission cost allocation. So there are a good number of kind of orders and rulemakings about this. So various energy climate advocates are at the rulemaking table trying to figure this all out. So I know there are probably a lot of people who can be on call to answer your more technical questions. My colleague at the law school, Professor Alex Klass, is doing a lot of work on data centers and the resultant uptick in projected electricity usage and what that means for transmission. Final thing I'll say, just because you mentioned eminent domain, is that you probably will recall the federal government tried a while ago to have national interest electricity transmission corridors. That failed. That attempt failed miserably. Congress has been trying this out for decades now, trying to figure out how to build in eminent domain for electrical transmission siting, in the same way that there, is for, certain natural gas pipeline siting, et cetera. It leaves a lot to be desired. There are the transmission siting issues, I think in some instances reflect this debate between sort of more traditional conservationists and climate advocates, and it's just not clear yet, whether those two communities have really been able to negotiate a a way for us to move forward with the transmission buildup that we absolutely need. There will have to be concessions made on environmental and natural resources protection. You just can't have your cake and eat it too. You're never going to. You've got to have concessions on each side. And I think what I see, unfortunately, is still too many conservation organizations who believe in climate change and the need to do something about it, really aggressively going after certain corridor segments, making it almost impossible to sight lines and not seeing, the importance of having them there to address the existential threat.
Thanks, Sone. And thanks for kicking us off, Rachel. Mark Alpert is next.
Yeah, thanks, Liesel and O'Day, for the great presentations. When talking about stories about the transition to renewable energy, I think readers are particularly interested in hearing about the local benefits of this transition. And I have sort of a personal interest in this. My family has a lakefront home in northern Michigan in the Little Traverse Bay, and we had a big ice storm last spring that caused a lot of damage, a lot of flooding. We had to replace our furnace, and it wasn't cheap. And I know that northern Michigan has since time immemorial, has had disruptive weather, in the winter and spring. And I know it's very difficult to tease out the financial effects of, global warming versus, ordinary weather events. But I'm just wondering if any studies have been done on this specific to Michigan. What are the financial benefits to Michigan of transitioning to renewable energy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And that ice storm was really, I mean, you talk about dystopian. Like, it was just something else to see all of those. I mean, just, acres and acres and acres and acres of trees like just snap like twigs. Yeah, that was quite the storm. It there are a lot of different ways to look at the cost of climate change, and I think when you mention benefits to communities, and that's really where it resonates, right? So when I was director, there were a variety of things that were clearly demonstrable to our changing weather patterns and weather weirding, right? So from the Edenville Dam collapse and the weather system that sat over that part of the state and dropped just massive amounts of rain, where we had already been fully saturated and the lakes and streams had been fully clogged, aquifers were full, lakes were full. And so then when you get these huge rain events, there's nowhere for the water to go. To the 2021 flooding in Detroit, where communities in Detroit were like not even dry from a round of flooding, and they got huge rain events. And that's the water infrastructure there is very undersized for the amount of weather events that we're getting now. It's the amount of rain that we get in such a short period of time. So I certainly think that there's been a lot of looking at this from certainly the insurance community, as well as, from firsthand, frontline communities where they're seeing these challenges. So I agree with you. I think that the need is to connect the opportunities around the energy transition to how it's going to make a difference for people from a day-to-day perspective. And that is where it gets tough. So like after the flooding events in Detroit that were back to back in 2021, and those communities, continue to deal with these types of challenges, it's how do you come up with some short-term improvements for those communities so they're going to see a difference fast, but then also, a lot of these changes are long term, like building better infrastructure, green infrastructure in Detroit also requires relationships, deepening of relationships with local governments and communities in the vicinity, from counties, townships, and others, in order to, actually be able to put the money together to do like pretty large infrastructure projects. And so I think there's a lot of complexity here, and that is part of what makes it challenging too, is our brains, certainly want to see simpler solutions than the complexity that is true when it comes to flooding infrastructure, coupled with these weather challenges and the energy transition that we're going through. Ultimately, to me, the solution is products and services that make people's lives better. And that's what we see with this as we're going through the energy transition, right? That's what we see with declining costs when you talk about the new, when you talk about wind and solar and other types of products, you see like declining costs and better use. And that's what really will make the difference on top of, where can communities really see that value in the short term.
Awesome.
I'll say very briefly,
Ode, do you want to? Yeah.
just briefly, we took a careful look at something recently at the clinic. People may remember there was some great MLive reporting about this actually, that there was a project proposed, utility scale renewable project that would be on state land in northern Michigan near Gaylord. That ran into some obstacles. Something similar happened in Wisconsin. In the Great Lakes states, for the most part, there's unfortunately a really a poor process for the state, natural resources agency to decide whether and how to host utility scale renewable. Now, it hasn't happened very often yet. As it happens, Illinois is the state with the best process on paper, but it has the least amount of, state land. But the states that have a decent amount of, public land in the Great Lakes, they don't really have a great process. Much of it is in guidance, and it's very non-binding, and it's not really in rules or statutes as much. But I think those states have an opportunity to improve their processes for deciding when and how to host utility scale renewable on state land, and that itself would be a great opportunity, Mark, for those agencies to require the developer, but also for the state agency itself to come up, with those benefits to local communities. Because if it's part of the public decision-making process and there's transparency, then the community is going to demand it. And in both instances, in both Wisconsin and Michigan, what happened was the community felt caught off guard, did not feel like there was transparency, did not think that there was enough of a discussion about the local benefits, and really came out against those projects when maybe they shouldn't have, if they had just known, how beneficial those projects would be to them in the short term and in the long term. So I think there's room for every state in the Great Lakes region to significantly improve its process to determine how to host utility scale renewables on public land, and then to explain benefits to communities.
Thanks, Ode. Garrett, you had a question.
Thanks. Lisa, I have a question for you. Gonna ask you to put your Eagle hat back on if you don't mind for a second here. And you were director during the transition from at the federal level from Trump to Biden. And I'm curious how that change manifested. If you could share some insights on what that experience was like at leading a state environmental agency, and if you think that there are any snags happening now, at Eagle, now that we've transitioned back to Trump, what do you think what do you think it's like there now? And if, is it business as usual at the staff to staff regional level, or what? I'm curious if you have any insights.
Yeah, great question, Garrett. So I was, fortunate, I guess, to be in that position when there was a lot of change, going from, as you correctly point out, a big change at the federal level in terms of partnership. And it was super interesting. I think, it's great to have the ability to kind of feel like you're able to line up processes a little bit more. But some of that isn't always partisan either. I have to imagine that it feels a lot different with Trump 2 than it probably did with Trump 1. It was something where when the Biden team came in too, they were moving with great haste and doing everything in their power to, think about what sort of policies they wanted and how quickly they wanted them. And in many cases, we were certainly able to be aligned and to kind of speed those processes. But there were also times when, we weren't always aligned. You're not always aligned with your federal partners. Again, some of these issues aren't partisan. They're more, content issue related. I think I would guess it's probably been tough, particularly with the government shutdown. But even before that, certainly from a university perspective, I can say with firsthand experience that some of the issues we were having is, we weren't people, federal employees weren't even authorized to like return phone calls. So, a lot of work came to a screeching halt. And I would expect that since that was what we saw in academic circles and through Sigler and NOAA and some of the other relationships that we have at seas across the federal government, that was likely also true from an Eagle perspective, working with, EPA, DOE, et cetera. I think it's probably no shocker that, Trump administration two has looked a bit different than Trump administration one. And I think that's probably been quite challenging. And in all fairness, just speaking with my Eagle hat on, as Garrett said I could, the Whitmer administration looks different at this point too, right? I mean, that's an administration with a year left, and that's different than an administration that is going into reelect, right? So things just, the wheels turn, the kaleidoscope turns, and things do look different.
All right, thanks, Liesel. Does anyone else have a question before I steal asking a question? All right, Cooper.
Hi, thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. I have so a lot of the reporting that I've worked on has focused on like issues of environmental injustices and racism, and that's something that I haven't heard brought up in this conversation so much. And I know that in Chicago, it's a particularly big issue on the South Side. I mean, there's like a quantum computing project going on right now that has had a lot of pushback from residents. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how issues of environmental racism fit into this conversation from a regulatory standpoint, and how people are addressing the disproportionate impacts that some of these projects that invest in clean energy are also having on like the local communities that are being affected when data centers are constructed and are facing some of the negative consequences of those constructions and other like environmental pollutants.
I mean, I can just briefly say that there's no longer any federal environmental justice law. So there's been an entire elimination of that law. So what that means is if there's any federal decision making that has to happen, Cooper, it will simply not address environmental justice issues at all. The current administration's position is that it would be unconstitutional and otherwise unlawful to do so. Now, you would think that that just means, well, fine, states and local governments can then do that work. But there's a wrinkle, a big wrinkle. I would have said that under, President George W. Bush, under the first Trump administration. Under this administration, though, that could be a little bit risky. And the reason is this. Unfortunately, federal Congress never got around to doing anything about environmental justice. So environmental justice at the federal level existed almost entirely from Executive Order 12898 and subsequent executive orders that were all just ripped up by the Trump in his second term. But additionally, what the Trump administration is doing is it is looking at state institutions. Of course, we're familiar with what's happening with universities, but it's looking at other state institutions, agencies included, to see whether they're going to act in any unconstitutional ways. And they believe that a state agency or a local, government that takes money from the federal government and that engages in any kind of race-based considerations is doing something unlawful. And we know that this particular administration is willing to go after those state institutions. So I think what those state institutions have to decide for themselves is, are they going to do it anyway, and then fight the federal administration, if they're investigated or sued, or are they going to, take the easier road and decide to, not engage in those considerations? Now, that does not mean that state and local governments can't address environmental injustice in other ways. They can continue to look at, communities that are overburdened by pollution, communities that have a low socioeconomic, status, etc. But if they do it in ways framed as you framed it, which is environmental racism, there's an additional threat now from the federal government that didn't used to exist under Republican administrations before, which is the threat of investigation and potentially enforcement for doing something that they deem unconstitutional, largely because of the most recent Supreme Court opinion in Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would say from a Michigan perspective, it's I hope what you hear me say when I say communities need to be engaged in these processes, it's communities really need to be engaged in these processes. So if it's a quantum computing facility in a disadvantaged area, like the community needs to be engaged. Same thing is true, with what we're seeing across Michigan with data center interest. We developed we I was fortunate to put in place the first environmental justice public advocate for the state of Michigan. We built the first environmental justice council within state government, and then an external advisory council as well, the Mackey-J. These were all steps that I'm super proud of, and I think really move the needle. I think we all want that needle. Well, I think it would be great for that to move further and faster. But I think those were really important steps. And that work is still happening under the Whitmer administration here in Michigan. And I think that it is a matter of how do we make sure that communities have seats at the table for whatever type of development it is, whatever. And this was something that was constantly frustrating for me at Eagle because I would be saying to companies, well, have you talked to the community yet? And their response was, we don't need to talk to the community. We need to talk to you for the permit. And I'm like, well, you need to talk to the community for transparency, public engagement, and acceptance. Right. But there's not, to Oday's point, we are similarly hamstrung, not in exactly the same ways at the federal level, but in similar levels at the state level. So anyway, it's a great question. There's a lot of content there for sure.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Cooper. We'll definitely get to that some throughout the week. And it's sort of like climate change. It's one of those questions that it's one of those topics that informs every question and every angle of this. And so I think it's important to point out, I did want you to hear that message from both Lisa and Ode that yes, this top-down pressure from the federal government is one force acting upon the world, but there's also all these other forces, right, at the state and community and county level that are pushing in a different direction, perhaps, to also address all these problems. So we're going to get out into the field to see all that. I think Lisa and Ode have very tight schedules and we need to let them go. I think that Garrett had one last question if there's time for it, but if people can't stick around for that, totally understand, and we will see you tomorrow night. Before I let Garrett ask this question, though, let's all give a round of applause to Lisa and Ode. Here's your Zoom standing ovation or seated ovation. We truly do appreciate your time. You guys have been good friends to IJNR, and we're just excited when we can get groups of journalists to hear what you have to say and ask you some questions.